in the institution of slavery. There were traditional sort of plantation enslaved people that were, rice was the real economic driver in colonial America. Most people don't know Charleston was the richest city in America for over 100 years. We're not that old as a country. Charleston was the richest city because of rice and because of the profitability of slavery. 17 out of the richest 18 people in the country were in Charleston, and the richest man in the world was in Charleston back in colonial America. So Charleston was a lot happening. So traditionally, sort of plantation enslaved people. There were, on the other end of the spectrum, free people of color, as they called them. And then there were people like Robert and his wife Hannah, who were more sort of urban enslaved folks. Robert and Hannah lived in an apartment above a barn on East Bay Street. And so my sense is, from what I've read, from what I understand, there was this really creative mix of people, and they interacted with each other, they learned from each other, they grew, and I don't think Robert, I think that was one of the reasons why Robert was able to do what he did, was because not only did he grow up, the circumstances that he grew up in allowed him to dream big dreams, and then to try to wonder, well, why aren't I free? But then he was around people that was a stimulating, kind of a social situation as well. So I don't know that this directly answers your question, but I think from my perspective, that's part of it. But yeah.
And I would say, just to add quickly, that Robert Smalls, what I found in doing the book, is that he embraced every opportunity that came his way. So Charleston had a lot of restrictions in place, the slave badges, etc., but he found ways around them, and that's what's particularly extraordinary about his story. He was determined to create a life for himself that was not determined by someone else, and that's remarkable to me. Thank you.
The one thing, if we have just another 30 seconds, but I think it's relevant to this. It sort of astounds me how shocked people are that Robert did what he did, that he took this boat and sailed it to freedom. But I sort of liken it to, if you are starving, you haven't eaten in 2 weeks, but yet you are put in a room with this amazing buffet in front of you, and then people leave and close the door. You're gonna, Robert, he wanted to be free. He had saved money. He had tried to buy the freedom of his wife and children, hadn't gotten that far yet, and then saw this opportunity and he took it. So
Well, tell us how we can help you get the book and get the story out.
Tell your friends. But I did hear that we have time for one more question, if there was someone waiting in the back.
I just had a question. When you're doing your research and as you're doing your writing, we write a lot about the men in history. Did you find yourself balancing out the women in his life and how, they were important?
It's a great question. I think, sadly, we don't have a lot to go on. Hannah, I think, had a big impact on this trip. I think she's an unsung hero. Of course, Hannah was his wife. I was determined to find an interview with her, and I looked and looked and looked, and I only found one mention of her in one article, and it was there was a correspondent in Beaufort at the time, and he happened to interview her on the street, and she explained that they had all decided, if it looked like they were going to be captured when they were trying to escape, that rather than going back to slavery, they would hold hands and jump overboard with their children and drown themselves. As much as I absolutely adore Robert Smalls, I think I'm biased, but of course as a woman, but I think, Hannah and Lydia, particularly his mother, really instilled in him such a sense of empowerment that I think could have very easily been lost to him. So I wish that there was more I could have added. I certainly was interested in the two women who were brought on board the ship. We don't exactly know their relationship to Smalls, but I did find an article later that said one of the young women that was on there, he hosted, once he was able to buy the home on Prince Street, he hosted a wedding for her, and he considered her his adopted daughter. But what history we'll never know, and that's That's why fiction is sometimes appealing. You can add that.
The one thing that I just quickly add, I think Lydia, his mother, is the real central figure in his life. I don't think Robert Smalls is Robert Smalls without his mother. And Robert had the somewhat rare opportunity to grow up at least the first 12 years with her. And, you know, traditionally, once children got to the point where they could be monetized, they were whisked away and sent to work, and Robert got a chance to grow up with her. I mentioned the quote. I think that speaks to something that she invested in. There are other examples where she sort of took him places to see the realities of slavery that he might have been shielded from otherwise. And so the other just quirk of history, when he was in Charleston when the Civil War broke out, she was, you know, still in Beaufort, and the Battle of Port Royal, November 1861, freed, essentially, not legally, but effectively freed her. So while Robert was in Charleston dreaming about freedom, I can only imagine that it worked on his nerves that his mom was free. So I think that was another element to this.
Sure, thank you. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for coming out. If you're interested in buying the book, you can get it right at our register up at the front of the store, and lines will start forming to the left right here if you're interested in signing.
I'll say that Michael will also be signing if you're
Yep.
interested in getting
He's not my literal brother.
Oh, but that's all right. No, we have all of those.
Here's a look at some of the current best-selling nonfiction books according to Politics and Prose Bookstore here in Washington, D.C. Topping the list, journalist Robert Wright offers his thoughts on the benefits of Buddhism in Why Buddhism is True. Followed by Remember the Ladies, a look at key players in the national suffrage movement by Angela Dodson. Third, Susie Hansen explores the world and reflects on America's global standing in Notes on a Foreign Country. Next is Devil's Bargain from Bloomberg Businessweek's Joshua Green on the relationship between President Trump and his former chief strategist Steve Bannon. That's followed by best-selling author Mark Bowden's recount of the turning point of the Vietnam War, Hue 1968. Our look at the best-selling nonfiction books according to Washington, D.C.'s Politics and Prose Bookstore continues with Minnesota Senator Al Franken's memoir, Giant of the Senate. Seventh is astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson's exploration of the universe, Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. That's followed by Stanton, a biography of Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War by Walter Starr. Next, film critic Ann Hornaday examines the inner workings of movie production in Talking Pictures. And wrapping up our look at the best-selling nonfiction books according to Politics and Prose Bookstore is J.D. Vance with his recollection of his childhood in a Rust Belt town in Ohio, Hillbilly Elegy. Many of these authors have or will be appearing on Book TV, and you can watch them on our website, booktv.org.
Does anyone else have an experience you'd want to share? Tyrone asks about his medication again, and Cynthia deflects. The conversation turns to drugs and alcohol when Tyrone instead begins talking about getting arrested for smoking a blunt. Everyone except the wallflower patient has something to say about drugs. May I say something minor? Asks Manny during a pause in the discussion. Sure, Cynthia nods. I don't mean to take up everyone's valuable time in the group. I know I don't deserve it. Thank you so much for letting me speak. Jamel sighs in frustration. You're fine, man. Just talk. Thank you, thank you. It's just that I struggled with alcohol for so long, almost 40 years now, and I've been sober since getting locked up. I hope so badly that I can stay clean when I get out. He seems to be a little more comfortable now, and so continues talking. He tells us about being whipped against the wall as a 7-year-old when he didn't do a good enough job cleaning up the mess from his father's partying the night before. One morning, Manny drank one of the glasses of leftover orange juice, not realizing that it was mixed with vodka. When his hungover father found out, he whipped Manny until blood seeped through his shirt. But, Manny said, it didn't hurt as much that time because he was tipsy from the alcohol. And so from then on, he drank as much alcohol as he could get his hands on. Thank you for letting me share, says Manny. I know I'm not worth your time. I wrote these words and I'm still getting a little tearful. Manny, says Jamel, leaning forward in his chair so he can see him clearly. You are worth it, man. You've got mad courage. You just hang on and keep going one day at a time. That's all you got to do. Jamel looks like he's about to cry, as though no one except this psychotic patient named Jamel has ever offered him kind words. Antoine and Tyrone look uncomfortable with this expression of emotion, but Campbell nods in agreement. Yeah, Manny, you just got to take it one day at a time. Think about all those days you've survived already. I glance at Cynthia to see if she is appreciating what is going on in front of us. Her eyes are wide and wet with amazement. We are witnessing a pivotal moment for Manny, perhaps for the group itself, a collective responsibility to care for someone else, and no one wants it to end.
You can watch this and other programs online at booktv.org.
And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. It's television for serious readers. Joining us now from the Freedom Fest convention is author Lee Edwards. His most recent book is A Brief History of the Cold War. Before we get into the Cold War, Mr. Edwards, how many books is this for you?
Probably 25, 26, but who's counting?
What topics?
Basically about American conservatism. I've got the best job in Washington, D.C. I'm there at the Heritage Foundation. I'm their in-house historian. They let me write books, so I've written books about Reagan, Goldwater, Buckley, Ed Meese, Ed Fulner, you name it. I probably have written a book about him.
Why are you a conservative?
I'm a conservative because I believe in freedom. That's one of the reasons why I'm here at Freedom Fest. Libertarians have got it right when it comes to the economic issues. They're not so terribly good when it comes to the social issues, which is why I'm a conservative and not a libertarian.
You have another book coming out this fall as well. What is that?
Well, this is a book I've been working on. People say, well, how long has this book taken you? And I'd say about 40 years. And it really is my memoir. It's looking back on the last 40 or maybe even 50 years and what I've been able to be a part of in the conservative movement, working with people like Barry Goldwater, writing about Ronald Reagan, getting to know Bill Buckley, all the great giants of American conservatism.
Entitled Just Right.
Just Right.
Well, we invited you here to talk about the Cold War. When and why, or when and how did the Cold War begin?
Well, that's one of the reasons why Elizabeth and I wrote this book. Elizabeth, our daughter, who was a professor at Claremont McKenna College, and I'm still teaching at Catholic University, by the way. So both of us teaching foreign policy, national security, we weren't happy, we weren't satisfied with the textbooks that we saw out there. And so we decided we were going to write a history of the Cold War, but a brief history, not a 500 or 600 page thing, but something that could be used in classrooms to educate young people particularly about the Cold War, which began way back, young people would say, in 1945 with a meeting between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin at a place called Yalta. And that began the Cold War, which continued until 1991. So some 46 years. It's one of the most protracted conflicts in which America has been involved. Very important one, and somewhat overlooked. People talk about World War I, World War II, but the Cold War in its way was just as important, just as significant in affecting the outcome of the world and of history as the other two.
Now, Mr. Edwards, that meeting at Yalta happened just a few months before the end of World War II, correct?
Yes. And FDR was dying at that point.
Was it January or February?
I think it was February. FDR was dying, looked terrible, but still he wanted to be there to try to pin down as much as he could what post-war Europe and the rest of the world would look like. And so they thought, he and Churchill thought they'd worked out an arrangement with Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, regarding forthcoming elections in Eastern and Central Europe. And Mr. Stalin said, oh, don't worry about a thing. We will have free and open elections there. And of course, Poland also was a key factor in their discussions as well. And they thought, on our side, the West, that things were been worked out. Things are going to be perfectly fine. And if they weren't, then we could depend upon the United Nations to keep the peace. It didn't work out that way.
Did they basically divide Europe amongst themselves?
Well, I think it's probably
much like Churchill did the Middle East at one time?
That's a little bit of a oversimplification, but there is a way of talking about it in those ways. But at the same time, what FDR and Churchill said to Stalin, now look, with regard to Eastern and Central Europe, we want free and open elections so that the people can decide which way they're going to go. And Stalin said, well, of course, we'll do that.
So you say that began the Cold War.
Right.
How did it develop?
It developed because in a very short order, really within a year, Truman realized that Stalin was not going to keep his word, that the Red Army had invaded and was now sitting in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the rest of those countries. And that he said publicly, almost publicly, I'm tired of babying the Soviets. And what was needed was a position taken from strength, position taken from a commitment to freedom and an opportunity for the people of Eastern and Central Europe to make up their own futures. But that then entailed some very definite actions on the part of Truman, including the Truman Doctrine, which supported Greece and Turkey, the Marshall Plan, which economically supported not only Eastern and Central Europe, but France and Great Britain, who were economically flat on their back and politically were really under some stress and strain. It's possible that the communist parties of those two countries, particularly France, might have been able to even win an election. So for those reasons, Truman, saying to himself, we must take a strong stand, began what was called a policy of containment, of making sure the Soviets could go no farther than they had, which was Eastern and Central Europe.
What was the Soviet reaction?
Well, they were not happy. They were a little bit shocked that we would take that kind of a position of strength, and that kind of a commitment, if you will, to the freedom and liberty of Eastern and Central Europe. And so they thought to themselves, well, what can we do? And they put the pressure on both Greece and Turkey. The reaction to that was the Truman Doctrine. They began agitating and propagandizing in France and England and elsewhere, the Belgium, the Netherlands, and so forth. Our reaction to that was not only the Marshall Plan, but also a military alliance, NATO, that really, truly brought about a serious commitment on both sides to a Cold War.
How did these two superpowers use surrogates during the Cold War?
Well, both of them used surrogates. For the Russians, it was the Moscow Pact, in which they brought everybody from Eastern and Central Europe into it and began saying to them, all right, now these are positions that you must take for the greater good of bringing about a communist world. We, through NATO, were working through people like Great Britain, France, but who could not do it on their own. They really needed our support both economically and militarily to bring about a balance, if you will, a policy of containment, as I say, to prevent the Soviets from moving any farther. And this precipitated one of the really critical acts that was taken, and that was the Berlin airlift of 1948. Really an extraordinary thing. Stalin cut off Berlin, West Berlin, which is in the hands of the West, and said, well, what are you going to do about it? And we launched an airlift of food and supplies, which lasted for over 1 year. You know, millions and millions of pounds of food and supplies, medicine, all the other things. And finally, Stalin said, okay, I understand you guys are serious about this, lifted the embargo which he had imposed upon West Berlin as a result of a very brave action by Harry Truman, one of the true heroes of the Cold War and of post-World War America.
During this 41 years or so that the Cold War was going on, did U.S. policy stay consistent?
Well, what happened was that in the beginning it was a policy of what's called containment, this idea, as I say, of this far and no farther. Then came a period under Truman, after Truman, under Nixon, and then a little bit under Ford and Carter, a policy of détente, the idea of meeting, well, maybe we can work with the Soviets. Maybe somehow, if we just bring about some kind of balance militarily, that we can sit down and do away with this idea of conflict perhaps being inevitable. That unfortunately did not work out too well, because during this period of détente, during the 1970s, this was the period when all of a sudden there were communist regimes in Africa, in Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola. It was the period when Nicaragua went communist. And so we could see, at least I should say we, I mean the conservatives could see, that there was a need for something beyond détente, that we had to go back not just to containment, but to something beyond that. And so this along came Ronald Reagan, who for the first time in almost 40 years talked not just about accommodation or détente or even a tie, but summed it up in a very famous talk that he had with Richard Allen, in which he said, Dick, I know this may sound simplistic about ending the Cold War, but I do have a solution. And Dick Allen said, well, what is that, Governor? He was then governor at that time. Well, it's very simple, Dick. We win and they lose. And that, no president had said that ever before, really, in those kinds of simple but yet very direct terms. Beginning out of that was a very sophisticated, it wasn't just something of dropping a bomb on Moscow and ending the war that way. As a matter of fact, Margaret Thatcher said about Ronald Reagan, he ended the Cold War without firing a shot. And that's precisely what he did by using a very sophisticated, multifaceted Reagan doctrine, which included psychological warfare, economic warfare, persuading people not to buy, for example, Soviet oil and gas, beginning with an arms race and a thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which made the Russians realize that they could not win an arms race. And that led to Mr. Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, who certainly is one of the important people of this period, of saying, okay, let's sit down and talk about how we can negotiate an end to the Cold War. Not on the battlefield, but at the bargaining table.
How close did we come to actual hot war during this period?
It's true, there was one period, and that was the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis of the late fall of 1962. Mr. Khrushchev had various offensive missiles, not defensive, but offensive missiles, put in place in Cuba, 90 miles away. Some of these missiles had a radius of 1,000 or even 1,500 miles. They could hit Washington, D.C., New York City, and so forth. This was a serious, would have brought about a serious imbalance in the nuclear situation between us and the Russians. President Kennedy said, we can't allow this to happen. And so there was a very serious period there of negotiating. How can we possibly get them? And happened that through diplomacy, and for this President Kennedy deserves much, much credit indeed. Let's talk again about how we can bring about an end to this impasse, this nuclear impasse, if you will, through negotiations. And that was something which worked out between Khrushchev and between Mr. Kennedy, which obviated any need for a hot war in the middle of the Cold War.
Lee Edwards, has anyone ever put a figure on the cost of the Cold War or how many lives were lost during the Cold War?
Well, some people talk about, for example, how many lives were lost in the Korean War on our side, about 35,000. People say, well, what about Vietnam, another shooting war during the Cold War? That was about some 58,000 Americans, and of course, many more Vietnamese, both North and South. So one could say easily that hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. And one could say at the same time that the cost of this was in the trillions over the years. People ask me, well, was it really worth it, Lee? Was it really worth it, all that? And I say, well, what price peace? And for my mind, bringing an end to the Cold War, which had been so much at the center of our foreign policy and our national security for more than 4 decades, that was a good price to pay to end that war peacefully, without any shot being fired.
What's the legacy of the Cold War with our relations with Russia today?
Well, I think initially they were pretty good. back in the times when Boris Yeltsin came in following Mikhail Gorbachev. There was a period there, one might say, of détente between us and the Russians. Not so good under Mr. Putin, although there's some changes going on there. We'll have to see how that plays out. But you cannot understand Russia without understanding the Soviet heritage and legacy. One has to realize that Mr. Putin spent the first 41 years of his life under communism, that he was 10 years being trained by the KGB. So one of the lessons from the Cold War is that legacies matter, that ideology matters. You can't touch base with somebody like that without taking into account that he had spent most of his life under communism.
Here's the book, A Brief History of the Cold War. Lee Edwards and Elizabeth Edwards Spaulding. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
So could you recount for us the importance of the Blackburn affair and the Underground Railroad,
No
the
doubt.
role that Detroit played?
I think earlier we had a sculpture, let me see if I can go back to it, that Ed Dwight, who's a fantastic sculptor, and he did the sculpture down at the waterfront, where you have these, a group of black people who are looking across the Detroit River, you know, to Canada. I think it's the next one here. This year in particular, many people have come to Detroit, and sometimes I guess they scratch their heads, well, what is that all about? This symbolizes, you know, the terminus of the Underground Railroad. When you have people like William Lambert, George D. Baptiste, William Webb, Madison Lightfoot, I mean, you can go on and on in terms of these pioneering abolitionists. They were joined at some extent by the white abolitionists, many of them being Quakers, because William Lambert had been schooled and educated and lived among the Quakers when he left Trenton, New Jersey, and arrived in Detroit. He, for me, is just a phenomenal individual because he was like one of the main conductors of the Underground Railroad. I know in my classes in New York City, when I talk about the Underground Railroad, the first thing hit their mind is the A train, you know, the D train, and say, no. You know, that Colston Whitehead has done his thing in terms of the metaphorical treatment, you know, of the Underground Railroad. But this was a process, the byway, in which, you know, these here fugitive slaves, you know, could get away from bondage, get away from the so-called peculiar institution and end up in Detroit. So this here, Ed Dwight's sculpture, it symbolizes the people, and certainly after 1850, when you had the fugitive slave law, when that act was passed, that meant that although, and we got the Blackburn case, the Blackburn affair, of these runaway fugitives who arrived from Louisville, Kentucky, and thought they had found a safe refuge away from these bounty hunters. But with the passing of the 1850 Slave Act, that meant you had to go a little bit further. So these people are looking across, you know, the Detroit River to Windsor. And sometimes even Windsor wasn't far enough. You had to keep going, Amherstburg, on up 401, onto Chatham, Ontario, onto Toronto. And of course, Chatham later on would become a very profound, community of abolitionists that was up there. We can talk about Osborne Anderson, who was one of the black men who rode with John Brown. And when you start talking about the later period, after the whole abolitionist beginning with William Lambert, here's Frederick Douglass comes to Detroit, and he meets with John Brown. There's a marker of it downtown. You know, Second Baptist Church was very instrumental in that. Of course, St. Matthew's was going to be instrumental later on. We cannot ignore the church, you know, and this whole coming together in terms of resistance, you know, the whole idea of self-determination. It was coming from a number of church leaders who were affiliated with the abolitionist movement, but no one more pronounced and profound than William Lambert. His story, I mean, that would make just a fascinating film to see the kind of stuff he went through, the mystery system that he put together. They had a coding kind of a secret code, secret language. You know, they had trained all these individuals on the Underground Railroad in case you encountered some of those bounty hunters out there. I mean, it's so instructive. And later on, his involvement with St. Matthew's Church and his involvement in the educational process, working with people like Fannie Richards, who was a pioneering black woman in terms of the first African American to teach in the so-called public school system here. So we have this conjunction, you know, and it's going to be a collaborative situation from one generation to another, each spurred on by the other, each, you know, taking its kind of influence and its enthusiasm for the breakthroughs occurring in the previous generation. We're going to see that happening time and time again in this whole odyssey of Black Detroit.
You can watch this and other programs online at booktv.org.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. My name is Mary Ellen Hannibal. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, founder of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and author most recently of Science in the Soul, Selected Writings of a Passionate Rationalist. Dr. Dawkins was voted Prospect Magazine's #1 world thinker and was on the Daily Telegraph's 100 Greatest Living Geniuses list. He earned his degree in zoology and doctorate in animal behavior from Oxford University and later returned to become the university's first Simone Professor for the Public Understanding of Science. His best-selling books include The Selfish Gene, The Blind Watchmaker, and The God Delusion. They have sold more than 3 million copies and have been translated in more than 30 languages worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Dawkins. Okay, are we all, can you hear me? That sounds pretty good. Not bad. Okay. So we have a lot of heavy-duty questions and things to ponder tonight. So I thought maybe we would start with something a little lighter and more personal. There's a really wonderful essay toward the beginning of this book, Science in the Soul. I have bound galleys, which gives me complete license to write all over these pages, which you won't want to do with your copy of the book. But
I'd like to read what you've written.
Some of it is fascinating. So I wonder, Dr. Dawkins, you have this wonderful essay about being influenced by Charles Darwin and by Dr. Dolittle. How many of you have read the Hugh Fleming book, Dr. Dolittle, or seen the film with Rex Harrison? Oh, so you all know. You pretty much know. That's pretty good.
Well, I do think there's some similarity between Dr. Dolittle and at least the young Darwin. I mean, they're roughly contemporary. And Dr. Dolittle was always sort of sailing in little ships, rather like the Beagle, and he was a great naturalist like Charles Darwin. And they both love animals. And I think I was genuinely influenced by Dr. Dolittle. I read all the books, I think. I've never seen any of the films, thank goodness.
The Rex Harrison is pretty good.
Are they?
Yeah, well, that one.
Yeah. I always think that if you really love a book, seeing a film spoils it. But anyway, I love Dr. Dolittle, and I think he did influence me. I think he influenced me to value non-human animals in a way that I might not otherwise have done. He's actually censored in quite a lot of libraries. He's not allowed in public libraries because of racism. And that was just a symptom of the 1920s, which is when Hugh Lofting wrote the books. I mean, everybody in Britain was racist at the time. And, but in a very gentle kind of way. But I think that that Dr. Dolittle more than makes up for it by his anti-speciesism.
Well, Dr. Doolittle, as you point out in the essay, he gets into fixes over and over again in which he is helped out of them by other animals who figure things out, what he needs, and sort of form webs of rescue for him.
Yeah, so he can talk to non-human animals, and that's really the plot of all the stories. I mean, everything turns on this one trick that he has. It's rather like good science fiction, where you just alter one thing, and then everything else follows from that.
Well, it struck me reading it. In the last couple of years, we've had quite a number of best-selling books, and some of them very good. For example, a book called Beyond Words by Carl Safina, who is a wonderful marine biologist. A book called The Soul of the Octopus by Cy Montgomery, who's a wonderful science writer. And they're focused on animal consciousness. And as Carl Safina says, animals care about their own life. They want to increase their own life, and they care about it furthering their own life just the way you and I do. And of course, there's kind of a plea at the center of these books for us to understand that we can't just be wiping these creatures off the face of the earth. And what I like about the Dr. Doolittle analogy or connection is that he is helped and aided by these animals in ways that we are also aided by animals, really without our understanding how we are connected to them quite consciously all the time.
Yes, I think it's a bit of a stretch to link it in quite that way, and it is a children's book.
That's true. All right, you're so right, actually. Another of the early in the book concepts. I mean, your writing is so accessible and it's just charming and easy to read. But then you have some, real concepts that really make you sit down and think about them pretty hard. And one of them I have just been really pondering a lot is your discussion of how humans and how this moment in time organisms are adapted perfectly because of this process of natural selection, which is law-like and has been selecting genes over eons to bring the next generation forth, is perfectly well adapted to the past, but not to the present or to the future. And that along with that, when we have these aggregates of lots of successful humans as we have now, we have these what you call emergent, I don't know if we're going to call them qualities or things that we create together, such as something like the internet, which then again is a little bit beyond our own capacity to deal with perfectly well. We're always going to be a little bit misaligned with our own present. This idea of time, I think, and our placement in it is very beautifully framed by the beginning opening of your book. And I wonder if you would read from that.
So this is the introduction which I wrote specially for this book. Much of the rest of the book is previously published essays, although many of them not previously published in this country. So this is the introduction. I am writing this 2 days after a breathtaking visit to Arizona's Grand Canyon. Breathtaking still hasn't gone the way of awesome, although I fear it may. To many Native American tribes, the Grand Canyon is a sacred place, site of numerous origin myths from the Havasupai to the Zuni, hushed repose of the Hopi dead. If I were forced to choose a religion, that's the kind of religion I could go for. The Grand Canyon confers stature on a religion, outclassing the petty smallness of the Abrahamics, the three squabbling cults which, through historical accident, still afflict the world. In the dark night, I walked out along the south rim of the canyon, lay down on a low wall and gazed up at the Milky Way. I was looking back in time, witnessing a scene from 100,000 years ago, for that is when the light set out on its long quest to dive through my pupils and spark my retinas. At dawn the following morning, I returned to the spot, shuddered with vertigo as I realized where I had been lying in the dark, and looked down towards the canyon's floor. Again, I was gazing into the past, 2 billion years in this case, back to a time when only microbes stirred sightless beneath the Milky Way. If Hopi souls were sleeping in that majestic hush, they were joined by the rock-bound ghosts of trilobites and crinoids, brachiopods and belemnites, ammonites, even dinosaurs. Was there some point in the mile-long evolutionary progression up the canyon strata when something you could call a soul sprang into existence, like a light suddenly switched on? Or did the soul creep stealthily into the world, a dim thousandth of a soul in a pulsating tube worm, a tenth of a soul in a coelacanth, half a soul in a tarsier, then a typical human soul, eventually a soul on the scale of a Beethoven or a Mandela? Or is it just silly to speak of souls at all? Not silly if you mean something like an overwhelming sense of subjective personal identity. Each one of us knows we possess it, even if, as many modern thinkers aver, it is an illusion. An illusion constructed, as Darwinians might speculate, because a coherent agency of singular purpose helps us to survive.
So I'll tell you what I wrote in my book upon reading those paragraphs. Is Richard Dawkins getting spiritual on us?
Well, that's part of the point. I mean, it's kind of meant to be a little bit provocative to put the word soul in the title. I said last night that I quoted one of my great heroes, Peter Medawar, great medical scientist and biologist and Nobel Prize winner. He said, I hope I shall not be, he was giving a lecture, and he said, I hope I shall not be thought ungracious if I say at the outset that nothing on earth would have induced me to attend the kind of lecture you may think I'm about to give. And I then said, I hope I shall not be thought ungracious if I say at the outset that if you have come hoping from the word soul to witness some kind of conversion, you're going to be disappointed. There are two meanings of the word soul, and somewhere in the book I quote two dictionary definitions from the Oxford Dictionary. One of which is the immortal soul, the religious soul, the supernatural soul, the one that survives your death. And that's not what I'm talking about. And the other is the sort of spiritual, aesthetic, emotional response to science, to the universe, to life, to deep time, deep space, that kind of thing. That's the sense of soul in which I use it in the title.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little on this emergent concept.
Yes, well, you were saying earlier about how, it's a very interesting point you were making, about how we are adapted to the past. All animals are adapted to the past. The genes that made us are genes that have survived through countless generations. You look back on your ancestors, and every single one of your ancestors, not a single one of your ancestors died before achieving at least one heterosexual copulation. It's obvious, but it's very significant, because very, very many of their contemporaries died young, died without having succeeded in reproducing. So we contain the genes that helped our ancestors to survive in the past. I've got a phrase which appears in the book and several others of my books, the genetic book of the dead. The genetic book of the dead is the genes in a modern animal which, in a sense, describe the past. The genes in an animal can be thought of as a kind of digital description of the worlds in which the ancestors of the past survived. Not the present and not the future. And as Mary Ellen has just pointed out, emergent properties mean that the future is going to be different. And in the case of human emergent properties, very, very different, because we are changing our environment at breakneck pace, much, much faster, I suppose, than any other animal has ever done. In a way, it's amazing that we do thrive so well in an environment which is radically different from the environment in which our genes survived in the past. We wear clothes. We live in huge cities. We get around in fast cars and fast planes and things like that. We do suffer from psychological problems, probably because the world in which we live now is so different from the one in which our biology was naturally selected. And this all comes under the heading of emergent properties.
So this very beautiful passage, the beginning that you've quoted here, where you framed the very, very long geological time frame and then the cosmic time frame, and then we have this person, you, observing both. And then you're talking about this past that we are very well adapted for, but this emergent future to which we are hurtling, and we're creating it as we hurtle. Now, this rate of change, why has it increased? Has it increased? Have we been increasing it because of our increased numbers, or what's causing this?
I think it is increasing, and if you think about the if you go back to the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on, that's huge spans of time in between each of those major advances. Agriculture, 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years or so. Then the Industrial Revolution, the invention of printing. Nowadays we have the computer. We have computers. Moore's law, the exponential increase in the power of computers, the speed and economy, the speed and cheapness of computers. We're living in an astonishingly fast-changing world, and it's showing no signs of slowing down. It's still accelerating.
So two questions kind of related to that. One is, it would seem that we're driven by our own invention of our own tools, the tools of perception in particular, starting with, we're referencing perhaps Galileo's telescope, but satellite technology, the microscope, the ability that we have to drill down ever deeper to ever more, finely granulated discernments of what reality is. And then, in this way that becomes very social, like with the internet and Facebook and Twitter becoming ways that we actually organize ourselves socially, it would seem that our tool making is actually driving our social behavior in many ways. And I wonder what you think about that. It's not like we decided that our arts, that our culture, that our understanding of history would be what determine us, but our tool making is really the thing, it would seem.
Yes, and I think there's a kind of it's rather like what biologists call coevolution. Advances make way for the next advance, and in our case, I think we have in the world of computers we have software-hardware coevolution, where advances in hardware make possible software that wouldn't have been possible before the hardware was invented, and then so. Each one paves the way, as it were, opens the door for the next advance, and that is getting faster.
I have to say, it would seem that one thing we're sort of dispensing with kind of willy-nilly as we go is biology, the biological reality of other species. One of the things, there seems a couple of thresholds that we've passed without really fully grokking what we've done. One is that the aggregate number of human beings on this earth has become a biogeophysical force, discernible in the fossil record. The American Society for Geophysicists, or is the American, I never get it right, but they want to now call our epoch the Anthropocene to reflect this profound impact of humans on life on Earth. Now, one of the things that we're doing is we're reducing biodiversity of other species. The way that some scientists put it is we're using up too much photosynthesis, so we're actually depriving other species of photosynthesis. But mostly it's really that we're taking away their habitat because we're putting so many more human bodies on the Earth that we're converting their habitat to human buildings for people to live in and agriculture to feed people. But we're doing something very scary to me, very dangerous and kind of tragic, which is reducing diversity itself. And I wonder if you could tell us about diversity in a very, going back to the very profound and simple mechanism of natural selection and how it depends on diversity, how our life has depended on diversity, and what are some of how do you see the horizon as we take it out?
I think it's more your subject than mine, actually, Mary Ellen. I mean, I mourn, as you do, the loss of diversity, and I mourn the extinction of species. If only at an aesthetic level. I mean, I think it's there have been mass extinctions before, and sometimes people say, oh, well, the mass extinction, the so-called sixth extinction that humans are now causing, it's no worse than the previous ones, no worse than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs and things. Well, maybe not, but it's tragic. And I respond to it in an emotional, aesthetic way. I mourn the loss of Thylacinus. I mourn the loss of the dodo, the passenger pigeon. But what you're talking about is something bigger than that, which is the catastrophic loss of species. And ecologists tell us that this is more than just the loss. They actually species are actually necessary for the continuation of the balance of the ecosystem.
I think it intersects pretty strongly with your expertise, because you were talking about the genes that are this genetic book of life. When I first started writing about evolution myself, and I was taught by evolutionary biologists that some species, like an octopus, has conserved genes in it that are so ancient because octopuses eventually, way back in time, evolved from ammonites from different species that in some cases no longer exist, but that those conserved genes that have persisted through the eons are very likely to be genes that are the most hardy and the most adaptable to future scenarios. So it's very important, actually, to conserve, especially species that have those ancient lineages, because those conserved genes are perhaps more important than more recent genes.
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. That is interesting. It is fascinating how some animals have conserved things for very, very long times, and others haven't. There's enormous variance in the sheer age of genes. Yes.
Well, to go back to your own words, because it really is more important to stay in your world, although I think they over intersect quite much. Right in that introduction, you have a sentence that says, it's not an unreasonable speculation that the progressive growth of consciousness in the infant mirrors a similar progression over the longer time scale of evolution. Does a fish, say, have a rudimentary feeling of conscious personhood? Now, to connect that a little bit with another essay that you have somewhat later, which is a really fascinating essay about the internet, in which you wonder if here's a sentence from it. The chapter is called Net Gain, and it's about how the internet may be changing the way we think. And here's your sentence: the unplanned worldwide unification that the web is achieving mirrors the evolution of the nervous system in multicellular animals. And then a little bit later you say the cloud is a superhuman interstellar traveler whose nervous system consists of units that communicate with each other by radio, orders of magnitude faster than our puttering nerve impulses. But in what sense is the cloud to be seen as a single individual rather than a society?
Yes, I mean, I should interject there that this cloud that you're talking about is from science fiction. It's a science fiction book by Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle was a great astronomer, and he wrote a lot of science fiction, much of it not very good, but his first science fiction book is extremely good. It's called The Black Cloud, and it's marred only by the obnoxious hero, which you can't help wondering maybe modeled on the author. Because the same obnoxious hero keeps turning up in all Fred Hoyle's under a different name. It's supposed to be a different character, but he's always equally horrible. Anyway, the Black Cloud is a superhuman, mega superhuman organism that appears, that comes towards the sun to feed on the energy of the sun. And eventually the human scientists on Earth get in touch with it and manage to communicate with it and learn about it. And it, different parts of the cloud communicate with each other by radio, and the scientists raised the very interesting question: in what sense are you, the cloud, a single individual? And the cloud replies, well, the question doesn't mean very much. When the rate of communication, the speed of communication between the different communicators is very, very fast, you might as well stop talking about them as different individuals altogether. And if all of us could communicate telepathically with each other, instead of having to go through the slow bottleneck of speech, if we could all, as it were, communicate our thoughts directly at the speed of light, the speed of radio waves, then we would be one individual. It wouldn't mean anything to actually talk about ourselves as being separate individuals. And I think the point you're getting at is that the internet may be moving towards a sort of science fiction future where it becomes a single being, a single living organism of some kind. And I think also another of the passages you read made an analogy with the development of a child, where it's been suggested that the consciousness of an individual child forms itself as a kind of melding of separate entities. The child starts off not as a single agent at all, but becomes a single agent through the same sort of melding as we've just been talking about.
It's all pretty fascinating. It's as Charles Dickens said, the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, looking at it both ways, it seems exciting.
Yeah, that's the way I feel, the best of times and the worst of times.
And then it's terrifying at the same time. Speaking of which, just reading, I was rereading The Selfish Gene, which I read many years ago, and I was reading a very contemporary book called The Gene, which is just out in the last year, which is also very good. And I was just remarking to myself how timeless your book, The Selfish Gene, is. That the profundity of what you're explaining in that book hasn't changed that much in the decades since it was published.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad about that.
Well, in my opinion. But a couple of things have changed, and one is our ability to mess with the gene. So now humans we can alter the gene at the germ level. We can suppress the expression of certain genes, and we've also developed the ability to insert influences on genes. And I wondered if you would explain what CRISPR is to the audience. Some of you probably know, but not everybody does. And tell us what you think about this moment in time when we've perhaps become the blind watchmaker ourselves.
Yes, as it happens, I read coming on the plane coming over from England a very interesting book on CRISPR by Jennifer Doudna, who lives in these parts. She's a professor at Berkeley. Going on planes is a wonderful opportunity to read books, isn't it? You're separated. I read this entire book between London and New York. Reading an entire book, by the way, is more than Donald Trump has done in his whole adult life. Genetic manipulation, the actual changing of genes, is something that has been possible to do only relatively recently. And one of the main ways of doing it has been to transplant genes from one organism into another one. And you've probably heard about cats that glow blue because they've had jellyfish genes put them in them and things like that. CRISPR is a new technique which Jennifer Doudna was one of the main pioneers of. And it's a wonderful book. I do recommend it. It's called Crack in Creation. And it's kind of semi-autobiographical about her career. But it explains all about the technique of CRISPR and the misgivings that she has about its possible misuse and the power that it might have. It is a very, very powerful, fast technique